Chapter 6 Comanches Boy. One thing Thad had not liked at home was going over and over scripture verses until he had them fixed in his memory. When he had complained about having to learn the text, his father had said, "The scriptures were given to man to guide and comfort him, but if you don't know them, they will never be of much help to you." The meaning of the words he memorized had not always been clear to Thad, but an order is an order, so he had memorized them. Now, as he rode, laced to the back of the Indian pony, his hands tied behind him, his body and legs raw and burning, his head sore and aching, he thought of what Pa had said. But he was too dazed to be able to remember anything but his misery and his bitter hatred of his captors. They rode until dark, then stopped in a little draw. No supper fire was made. The Comanches had jerky of buffalo meat and a little pemmican. They gave Thad some of it, plus a handful of parched corn and some pecans. They had left behind them the country familiar to Thad, with its deep-banked creeks bordered with elm and pecan trees. They had passed through country of rolling prairie and low ridges such as he knew at home, where great old live oak trees rose out of a deep sea of grass, and were now in scrub oak country. It was not very pretty. Every hill had a heap of rocks sticking up on its top. Here in the draw was a heap of rocks that seemed to tumble down the ravine. Halfway to the summit of the hill was a cluster of those boulders that had formed a wall around three sides of an enclosure. Thad's Indian guard, a young fellow with the usual mask of war paint and meanness, pulled him from the horse's back. By this time Thad was a bleeding, bruised bundle of raw misery. The Indian pushed the stumbling boy ahead of him, over the rocks to the little enclosure. Thad motioned with his bound hands to him. "I can't climb over these rocks with my hands tied," he shouted, hoping the louder he yelled, the more likely he was to be understood. But the Indian only grinned maliciously and shoved him on. The older Indian, who seemed to be the leader of the little band, had heard Thad. Evidently, he understood something of the white man's language, and he gave a sharp command to the boy's captor, whose name, Thad learned later, was Two Lances. Then he stepped over and untied the rawhide thongs that bound Thad's hands. They were sore and numb, and Thad stretched his fingers, bending and unbending them until he could get a hold on the rocks. The older man then brought Thad a breechcloth, a worn pair of moccasins, and a piece of moth-eaten buffalo hide. "Put on," he ordered. Two Lances pushed the boy into the enclosure among the high rocks and motioned him to lie down. Thad drew his piece of buffalo hide around his shivering body and obeyed. It was the first of their commands that he was more than glad to obey. Thad's captors had put in a long and busy day and were soon fast asleep. Before Thad's guards lay down, he had tied the captive's ankles together with a thong of buckskin and attached this to his own wrist. "Like hobbling a horse," Thad muttered to himself. The breast of Two Lances, lying across the opening in the cluster of rocks, was soon rising and falling in a regular rhythm. But although Thad was dead tired, hungry and sore, he could not go to sleep. Thad had been looking for a way to escape ever since two lances and his friend had captured him. But now he lay weak and exhausted, discouraged and afraid. He called to mind stories of the Comanches' torture of the white captives. He remembered One Eye Johnny Ainsworth's disfigured face and what had happened to little Celie and her mother. He realized then how foolish he had been to venture so far away from Travis and Little Bit that morning. He thought with trembling of what might be in store for him, and how his parents and brothers would be worrying about him. He was afraid they might risk their own lives trying to rescue him. Stark fear took hold of him until he recalled what his father had said about learning scripture texts. They can never do you any good if you don't know them. He began to pray in earnest that God would help him. Suddenly, something happened that he was never able to explain afterwards. Later, some people insisted that it was only a dream, but he knew what happened, for he was wide awake. A voice sounded in his ears, a strong, clear voice that sounded to come from just behind him. It said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. He lay still, his eyes wide open, tense, listening. The voice came again. The angel of the Lord encamps around them that fear him and delivers them. The words of the words were texts of scriptures he had learned months ago. He waited, thinking with more hope than he had yet felt. He had not understood those texts until now. He thought of how the Comanches had beaten him with a stick when he whimpered, and had beaten him even harder when he cried out in pain. He was afraid that tomorrow he might cry out again, so he added this to his prayer. And please, Lord, don't let me show these Indians that I'm afraid. He thought this over, for it did not seem quite the right thing to ask. Then he thought of an improvement. Dear Lord, don't let me be afraid. He went to sleep then, with a feeling that help would come. Awakening early, he remembered Melissa and his desire to find her and rescue her from the Comanches. He prayed, help me find Melissa, Lord, and get her away from the Comanches. Thad had asked the Lord alone to deliver him, yet he wanted God to deliver Melissa with Thad's help. But this did not occur to him then. Two lances stirred and sat up. A call came from outside. He loosened Thad's legs and yanked him to his feet, and then pushed him ahead of him into camp. Morning had come, another hard day. They crossed the Colorado that day, and after that, Thad was in country entirely new to him. Every morning he was kicked awake at daylight, and his ankles unbound. After a breakfast of jerky and pemmican or parched corn, they traveled toward the west. After the fourth day, the Comanches decided that they were not being followed, or that if they were, their trackers had lost their trail. They shot an antelope, and once a day thereafter a fire was made, and a hasty stew of antelope meat was prepared. They had been traveling 6 days when a band of 20 or 30 braves joined them, coming in from farther southeast. They drove a herd of about 200 horses. Since all wore brands, Thad knew they had been stolen. None of the brands, however, were familiar to him. Judging from the direction from which they came, and the fact that he was not acquainted with the brands, he figured that they had been stolen in San Saba or Cola counties. At this time was so few men to guard the frontier. The Comanches sometimes raided as far east and south as San Antonio. From his brothers, Thad had learned some of the Indian sign language as well as some Comanche words. His brothers had been merely passing time when they taught the words to him, but now the knowledge served him well. It was easy for the boy to pick up strange words. So with what he already knew, he learned the Comanche language rapidly. He spoke to his captors in their own tongue whenever possible, and it seemed to please them. Some of them took the trouble to teach him still more. The newcomers told how they had taken several captives, among whom were a woman and two boys. They said they had to kill them because they fought so hard. Thad was able to understand what they were saying. As he lay at night on the ground, hungry, cold, and homesick, Thad tried to recall scripture texts that might encourage him. One night, the words of John 14:13 came to his mind. Whatever you shall ask in my name, that will I do. He tried to hold on to that as a promise for himself and to believe that help would come. The 91st Psalm came to mind, especially the verses that say, You shall not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flies by day. He realized that he had not really felt fear since the first night, when he had asked to be kept from fear. That, he believed, was why two lances and the others had kept him alive and did not beat him any more. They respected courage. He kept a cheerful face, obeying orders as though it was what he wanted to do. Thad saw a little bit every day, but it was no comfort to him. After the second day, her bridle and saddle had been transferred to the horse ridden by Red Wolf, father of Scarpony. Every little while during the day, Scarpony would rein little bits close beside the pony Thad was riding and give Thad a big grin. It irritated the captive boy at first, and he wondered if Scarpony was trying to frighten him or merely gloating over the stolen pony. After a time, he realized that the grin was more mischievously friendly than it was malicious. It was a sort of teasing grin. Thad had the feeling he had seen that face before, but he could not remember where. Little Bit's mouth was bloody from the jaw rope the Indians used on her as they did on the other horses, and it made Thad furious. But there was nothing he could do about it. His own troubles had eased some since he had quit showing fear. Two lances no longer bound his ankles at night, though Thad still rode surrounded by a load of rough tools and utensils. He learned to shift them around so that they were not so uncomfortable. Thad often wondered if he would see Melissa, though he had no assurance that she was alive. He knew there were many bands of Comanches in West Texas, and that although they might get together at times, the chances were small that he would find himself with the same band that held her captive. He had also heard that many of the white captives of the Comanches were sold as slaves to the Mexicans in New Mexico, and no other to other tribes of Indians. By mid-morning of the 10th day of travel, Thad knew they were getting close to the Comanche camp. A loud yammering of dogs could be heard almost a mile away. His heart was thumping as they rode toward the village. Dozens of teepees made of poles and painted buffalo hides rose in the plain beside a small stream. They looked like a forest of fat trees. There was a country fair atmosphere about the setting, with the noise of welcome drums and shouting, chattering people. Thad wondered what lay ahead of him here among these wild appearing people. There was a melody of odors to greet their nostrils in the village, including meat drying on racks, hides curing, and campfire smoke. Most of the odors were warm and homey. Mingled with the other odors was that of an incense made of dried sweetgrass, which infused a pleasant fragrance. With the Indians, this fragrance was a favorite. As they rode into the village, a swarm of women and children, all talking at once, gathered about them. The women looked Thad over contemptuously, and the children spat at him and threw stones and sticks. He looked about him in wonder as he dismounted from his horse. He was amazed at the height of the teepees, in their neatness and beautiful decorations. Here and there among them was a tethered horse, and he noticed that all were in good condition. They were decorated with paint, ribbons, and feathers. These, he supposed, must be the favorite horses of some of the villagers, for he had seen a great herd of horses out on the plain beyond the village as they were approaching. Thad was taken before the village chief, to whom two lances was apparently presenting him as a gift. The chief was a tall man for a Comanche, rather on the portly side, wearing a great bonnet of eagle feathers. His hair was in two braids that hung almost to his knees. The braids, woven with strips of bright red flannel, were extended by strips of beaver fur and ornamented with silver discs. His buckskin garments were beautifully decorated with embroidery of beads and dyed porcupine quills. The captive boy, however, was too worried about his own situation to see all this. He saw only the magnificence of the impressive figure and the frightening effect of, of the painted lines on his face. The chief was surrounded by braves of all ages, painted and ornamented, though with less splendor than Yellow Cloud. Red Wolf, father of Scarponi, who had been in charge of the raiding party that had taken Thad captive, had halted his band just before entering the village. These Indians, too, had donned feathers and war paints for their entry. Now he was talking to Yellow Cloud, and Thad was able to understand some of the conversation. Red Wolf turned to him, pointing to the chief. He said, "Yellow Cloud, his name." Yellow Cloud glared at the captive boy, then issued an order. Two lances and another of the braves, each holding Thad by the arm, led the boy to the center of the village. And now he thought, I must not show them that I am afraid. He looked straight ahead, praying inwardly for protection. The yammering crowd of villagers followed, shouting insults, spitting and lashing with sticks and whips of braided leather. He was in a daze from blows on the head by the time he was tied to a stake and wood was piled about his feet for a fire. There for a time he was used as target for stones and sticks and whips. Several women jabbed him with their short-handled spears. There seemed to be no intention of hitting him in a vital spot. They were having their fun with him before they finished him off, he guessed. Thad was near to losing consciousness, although he had not once cried out from pain. Before the torchbearers had reached him, a stir in the crowd caused him to look about. A woman, plump and motherly, appearing was screaming shrilly at the crowd and pushing her way toward him. She seemed to be addressing some of her remarks to Yellow Cloud. The chief issued an order then, and as suddenly as it had begun, the captive's abuse ceased. He was profoundly grateful to the woman, whoever she was. Two lances, grinning broadly, untied the thongs that bound Thad to the post and led him to Yellow Cloud.